So my story of this video begins with a discussion in the Step Back Discord server where some people were just asking me what my thoughts were on the chances that Canada was breaking up. Now, there's a lot of stories about Quebec separatism out there. I've made one myself, actually. But it's not very often that we talk about Alberta and the West, and how there is always a slight threat in the back of our minds that the West will one day pick up and leave. So yeah, the Alberta separatist movement is having a little bit of a moment right now.
We're going to make Alberta great again, and that is when we cut ourselves off from the leech that is Eastern Canada.
And after the 2019 election, which occurred back in October, there has been some changes. After the re-election of Justin Trudeau, the term Wexit started to trend. People were asking me about Wexit, people were asking me about Alberta separatism, and I was curious myself, so I decided to take a look into it, and what I found was something absolutely terrifying. So please, hold on, we're in for a ride. Now, Alberta separatists have been around for a very long time. The province joined Confederation in 1901, and the first calls for separating Alberta from Canada were as early as 1935 with the Social Credit Party. There were attempts at trying to build a movement or a political party or something to get Alberta to separate from Canada, but none ever really caught on in a big way. While polls of people in Western Canada seem to show a high percentage believe that the West would be better off without Ottawa, when it comes to actually voting for separatist candidates or proposing referenda, they don't really come out. Most of the time, Alberta's anger is because Canada won't bend over backwards to satisfy their every economic whim, but that's a different story. And honestly, maybe this time the movement actually has legs. I mean, everything's kind of stopped making sense these days, so why not? Now, Albertans would say that they have very distinct cultural and economic aspects to them that make them distinct from the rest of Canada. I've looked at different sources, different explanations, but it basically comes down to three major factors. The first would be oil. You really can't talk about the story of Wexit and Alberta separatism without talking about the fact that Alberta is the country of Canada's largest source of petrol. There's always been a strong resentment towards Canada because of things like the National Energy Program, which basically tells Alberta that they have to prefer selling their oil to Canadian markets rather than selling to the United States, where most Albertans think that they will get a better deal. The other issues are something called Equalization Payments. Now, here in Canada, we have 10 provinces and 3 federal territories, all of which have extremely different economies, and some are doing very well at different times. Some are in deep economic depression. Because Canada relies primarily on primary resources, lumber, oil, wheat, and natural gas, that kind of thing, those types of resources are very prone to boom and bust cycles. So different provinces are going through eras of huge growth and giant collapse at different points in their history, and people move around to, fill out the labor market. Equalization payments are a way to make sure that all of Canada still gets at least a modicum of a decent amount of money to support all of our social services in those provinces. So a bunch of tax money goes into a big federal pool that then is run through a Byzantine algorithm and distributed to the provinces based on how much they need to make sure that everybody's getting roughly the equal amount of money for what they need in their populations. Ever since this has been a thing, Alberta's had a very strong feeling that they are giving more than they're getting back from this system. In many ways, it's a larger provincial version of being against wealth redistribution. So it comes down to the two principles of right-wing politics. More money for us, and you. Speaking of right-wing, Alberta is also much more conservative and much more right-wing than the rest of the country. One example would be in 2004, the Liberal Party formed a minority government in Canada when Alberta voted 61% for the Conservatives. Oftentimes, if you look at electoral maps of Canada, Alberta is a sea of conservative blue, while the rest of the country is a little bit more diverse. And animosity from Western provinces towards Ontario and Quebec specifically is not limited to Alberta. Many Western provinces in rural BC and Manitoba and Saskatchewan also have a strong sense of animosity towards what they would call Laurentian elites. So the first time that Alberta ever considered breaking off from Canada was in 1935 when the Social Credit Party was running this province. They had a new economic model that was focused very much on consumption. It was an idea that would have been absorbed by Keynesian economics a little bit later, but Ottawa really didn't like the idea and used a very rarely used point of privilege to force Alberta from having this actually rather socialist-leaning idea of how to run their economy. Some people called for secession, but for the most part it was not heeded. Another example would be with Trudeau, not our Trudeau, his dad. When he was Prime Minister, put in something called the National Energy Program, which, as I mentioned, preferred Alberta selling its oil to local markets rather than selling abroad to the United States, which made Albertans very, very angry and more or less killed the Liberal Party in Alberta for the future. That sentiment then declined in the 1980s when the Progressive Conservative Party took over, especially under the prime ministership of Brian Mulroney. But when a CF-18 contract was given to the Montreal company Bombardier instead of an Albertan company that had a much better deal, the Albertans rioted. This scandal led the Albertans to break away from the Progressive Conservatives largely and start the new Reform Party. The Reform Party started to gain momentum, and the Progressive Conservative Party had a major collapse after the 1993 election. In 2000, the Reform Party merged with another party to become the Canadian Alliance, and then in 2003 merged with the Progressive Conservatives to become a Canadian Conservative Party, the one we know of today. I remember this very well because in 2003, I was in high school and I was taking my province mandatory civics class, and we actually did a project on the Conservative leadership race between Belinda Stronach, Stephen Harper, and a different guy that I forget the name of now. But I'm getting distracted here. In the 21st century, separatists started to get organized and angry once again. One of the major things that made them angry was that Canada decided to join the Kyoto Protocol, which was a very early attempt to do literally anything about climate change. And anytime Canada tries to do even the smallest, tiniest, even performative thing about climate change, Alberta has a meltdown. But this movement quieted down when Stephen Harper became Prime Minister, who was himself a former Canadian Alliance and former Reform Party member, and an Albertan himself. But then it came roaring back when in 2015, Canada elected Justin Trudeau.
Sunny ways, my friends, sunny ways.
Now, I should mention that Trudeau has done pretty much everything that a Canadian Prime Minister could do to aid and assist and grow the Albertan oil industry. I mean, the ruling Liberal Party literally put up federal dollars to buy an oil pipeline when the private company that was building it backed out. And of course, the large ignoring of Indigenous rights by building pipelines through their ancestral territory.
Sunny ways.
But once Trudeau said that at some point in the far future, and in an extraordinarily gradual way, we're probably going to have to shut down oil production in Alberta. And oh boy.
What are the things you want to be heard on?
We need a government who champions our resources. It's just that simple. I mean, we're such a rich province.
This is a federal government that has bought a pipeline that says that pipeline will be built.
I don't believe it.
Alberta went ballistic. This is when you saw things like the Yellow Jacket movement start to rise up in Alberta. You started to see the rise of far-right activism, calls for Trudeau to be put out of power, calls for Trudeau to be murdered. The Albertan nationalist slash Canadian nationalist slash far-right person has had this vitriolic hatred of Justin Trudeau. And after Trudeau got reelected in 2019, it led to the Wexit movement as we know it today.
Sunny way.
This is where things are going to start getting a little wonky because this is stuff that happened less than 2 months ago. But already, in December of 2019, a Wexit party is applying for federal party status with plans to run candidates in the next federal election in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia, with a strong idea that they would need to get Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and British Columbia on board and not just be Alberta in order for Wexit to happen successfully. And as of last month, separatist ideas in Alberta have shown historically high interest. This is probably more popular than any Albertan separatist in history. The Conservatives have decided that they're going to keep their distance from it, but they do claim that the Wexiteers have legitimate concerns, because they know where their bread is buttered. Jason Kenney, the current premier of Alberta, while he's a staunch federalist, does not want to leave Canada, wants to use the energy of the Wexit movement in order to flex Alberta into being able to get some more concessions and maybe a little bit more independence out of it. They want to have their own pension plan, which is separate from Canadian pension plan. They want to make their own police and not be reliant on the RCMP, and they want to be able to conduct their own foreign policy. A lot of the misinformation that Wexiteers are using to push their separatist agenda were pushed by Jason Kenney, who, by the way, was one of the people who designed the formula for equalization payments, but we guess we just don't talk about that part. Making claims like Alberta gives money to Quebec when it's much more complicated than that. It comes from income taxes from across the country, but whatever. And the federal Conservatives, who are currently the opposition in a minority government, which can be very unstable, are going to basically use this and say, do what we say, or, the separatists are going to win. Now, we probably should say how Alberta's oil production actually works. You've probably heard of the tar sands. The PC term to not offend Albertans is the oil sands, so we're going to call it the tar sands. The tar sands are one of the most environmentally destructive ways to make oil on Earth, which says a lot because there's really no real way to harvest oil that isn't environmentally destructive. When it comes to our addiction to fossil fuel, the tar sands are often described as the desperate point when you're injecting drugs between your toes. The tar sands absolutely destroy environments. They use massive amounts of precious fresh water. And it's part of the oil industry. That industry that we need to be stopping, like, in less than 10 years, if we want to live. And the Wexiteers are angry despite the fact that Justin Trudeau has laid out every single red carpet for them. All of their pipelines are getting built. They're angry that they're just not getting built fast enough for their liking. And Alberta's mad that even doing the slightest thing to combat climate change is a direct attack against them and their people. Which makes sense because Alberta has done nothing to transition off of oil. And they have no plans for when the oil stops. There's no capital fund like in Norway. There's no massive investment in big towers like in Dubai. They've transitioned it all into tax cuts. So many in Alberta knows that if the oil stops, they are royally and they've had decades to prepare for when oil ends and have decided to double down and do nothing. Now let's talk a little bit about the leader of the Wexit movement, a guy by the name of Peter Downing.
We're going to make Alberta great again, and that is when we cut ourselves off from the leech that is Eastern Canada.
He is a former RCMP officer who was fired for making threats, and also a former candidate for something called the Christian Heritage Party, which is just as terrible as you'd expect, with arguments to turn Canada essentially into a Christian theocracy, with bans on gay marriage, even bans on being gay, period, bringing back the death penalty, and even banning blasphemy as a thing. In 2016, he had to leave a progressive conservative board because he made the claim that a restaurant was supporting terrorism because they allowed the option for halal meat. On social media, he says he's against crybaby liberals, communist elites in the East, and beta males. Because of a triangular graphic in the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation, he was convinced that somehow Trudeau was normalizing pedophilia. He's called refugees ISIS members that are being smuggled into the country with the help of Justin Trudeau. He's called our immigration policy a program to destroy the white Anglo-Saxon race, and with almost needs no saying, he is a big fan of Pizzagate. So what would Alberta actually get if it left the country? What would it be like? They would lose quite a bit. First things first is they would lose all of our treaties. Canada has spent decades and decades building strong international relationships, alliances, things like the WTO, things like whatever NAFTA is going to end up being, even things like the United Nations are all not guarantees for Alberta, and they would all of a sudden be whisked away and they would have none of Canada's reputation in those. There is, of course, the issue too that large parts of Alberta are national parks which belong to the federal government, and there are Indigenous people who live in Alberta, a lot of them, and their territory would also be problematic because I believe the federal government has some jurisdiction there. In order to make their tar sands functional, Alberta would be a little screwed in the labor department, especially because many Wexiteers are, of course, super anti-immigration, and right now mostly work off the fact that they exploit the poverty of people in places like Newfoundland in order to get workers for the oil fields. Plus, like, LOL at the concept of Canada giving them their pipelines if they've like left the country over pipelines. Alberta would also be a very small economy that is very reliant on a single industry, specifically oil, which has fluctuating price systems, which would make Alberta's currency extremely volatile, leading to massive spikes and massive declines, which both could be really bad depending upon the world situation. It's basically called Dutch disease, where, like, say if oil was really expensive and Alberta was doing really well, their other industries would suffer because then, you know, your average Alberta cow farmer wouldn't be able to sell beef to other countries because it'd be too expensive because their currency is too strong. The idea of their currency being so tied to the price of oil would make it even harder for other industries to flourish, and Alberta would be even more reliant on oil than it is now as a necessity, which would make getting off oil, which is a project that, you know, the whole world's gonna need to do, much more difficult. Even if they didn't build pipelines, Alberta, if separated from Canada, and Saskatchewan, if they got Saskatchewan too, would be the single most environmentally destructive country per capita on Earth. The current highest production of CO2 per person in the world is Qatar, where they produce about 30 cubic tons of CO2 per person per year. An independent Alberta would produce 50 tons of CO2 per person per year. And of course, there'd be another issue that a lot of countries have, which is that they would be landlocked. The Wexiteers argue, and it is true that there is a UN policy that landlocked countries do have some special stipulations so they can get access to the sea, but also many Wexiteers think that the UN is an evil globalist agenda run by brackets them, and so they probably wouldn't get involved and they wouldn't be able to have access to those rights. Another thing is that Alberta would not be able to hack off part of Canada without absorbing some of Canada's federal debt. So if Alberta decided to separate, maybe it wouldn't be able to hack it as its own country. So one plan B that's often floated around is that Alberta could then leave and join the United States as the 51st state, which would be even worse for Alberta than being a part of Canada. Canada is a much more decentralized country than the United States is, so Alberta individually would have less autonomy over its own things with the much larger American federal government, and they wouldn't be saved from equalization payments either. Many states in the United States have tax money redistributed to other states at much higher numbers than Alberta does in Canada. Also, Alberta would be party to the US's federal debt, and their portion of that federal debt, which compared to the federal debt of Canada is more than double. And like, while Alberta has produced 3 of Canada's 23 prime ministers, that's a lot of influence. In the United States, Alberta's population would be about on par with Oregon, which has yet to produce a single even vice president in the United States. So, you know, they'd be a much smaller fish in a larger pond, if that makes sense. And if anything, if Puerto Rico's taught us anything, that being part of the United States doesn't always mean being a state, and it's not always good to be under that umbrella when you don't have those decisions. Now, Wexit has already caused some negative issues in Alberta. For example, an unnamed 1,000 employee tech company was going to set their headquarters or start an office in Calgary, but decided against it because of the Wexit movement. And of course, we can't talk about Wexit without talking about its extensive connections with the Canadian far right. I'm wearing this like camo Canadian hat to kind of talk about how a lot of Canadian nationalists all of a sudden are Albertan nationalists, but at these Wexit events, they're literally selling blue hats that say "Make Alberta Great Again." The connection's not subtle. One of Wexit's media allies is Rebel Media, which is basically like Breitbart, but for Canada. It's led by the Canadian version of Steve Bannon, Ezra Levant, and was the organization that hired Faith Goldie. So, you know, you can thank them for that. And in a wonderful investigation by Yellow Vest Exposed Canada, the moderators of many of the Wexit social media pages have connections to other far-right social media pages. Some are openly anti-Muslim hate groups, Some have actively called for the murder of Prime Minister Trudeau. These have referred to refugees as parasites, have rallied to stop the building of a mosque in Fort McMurray, Alberta, made references to Slobodan Milosevic as an aspiring figure and how to deal with Muslims. Milosevic was the leader of Serbia who committed a mass genocide of Bosnian Muslims. They've been connected to groups that called the Churchill shooting earlier this year a false flag operation, and references to anti-Semitic groups, Nazis, the whole shebang. And this movement is thankfully not as big as it appears in media, but that's kind of the problem. It's being inflated artificially. First by bots. The day after the election, when Wexit trended on Twitter, the growth of the Facebook page for the Wexit movement doubled in less than a day. And there are a lot of signs that that growth was generated by bots. And because it's dramatic and interesting and it attracts eyeballs, the media is also giving it extraordinarily normalizing coverage. The media covers their rallies, which in turn attracts more people to go to the rallies, and media figures are starting to legitimize Peter Downing as like a right-wing muckraker. Peter Downing, that person who I said all those things about earlier?
The leech that is Eastern Canada.
We live in dark times, and this is a scary development. And if enough weird confluences in the right way, we could have Alberta or possibly one or two other provinces leave the country and turn into this far-right republic in the heart of North America through hate mongering and misinformation and social engineering. And that's a scary proposition to see a country like that, because Alberta, given its view on the immortal power of oil and its refusal to do anything about climate change lest they lose a single job, is a death cult. Alberta is a death cult. Their general economic policy is that they'd rather see the world burn than see GDP lower by even 1 point right now. I'm genuinely terrified of what this could turn into. With the rise of the far right in Canada, especially in the West, this whole Wexit thing could go in some very scary directions. And what that means for immigrants living in Alberta, what it means for the Indigenous people of Alberta, it's scary. In the meantime, if you're one of those people who wants to see Wexit happen because you just want to see the map change, you can kindly go f*** yourself. And in the meantime, I guess I'm gonna go draft an emergency plan so we can air evacuate Dan Olson and Sarah Zed. Thank you all for watching this video. If you want to learn more about Canadian nationalism and the Canadian far right, I have a video right here on Canadian nationalism and the War of 1812 you'd probably enjoy. I also have another video on the Canadian far right that you might also find interesting. I also want to say that this video would not have happened if it wasn't for the amazing work of a couple of my friends. First of all, I want to thank my friend Jeremy. He's a reporter in Medicine Hat, Alberta, who was once actually doxxed by the Canadian version of Steve Bannon, Ezra Levant. You can find him on Twitter at @MHN Jeremy Appel, where he reports and writes columns and articles about Albertan and Canadian politics. I really recommend. He's a good follow. Second, I'd also like to thank the Canadian hate group watchdog Canadian Yellow Vests Exposed. It's a Twitter account, and that's another Twitter account you should really follow if you're interested in the things going on in the Canadian far right. And of course, it's a holiday time, and if there's a Step Back fan in your life, you can actually get them one of these t-shirts that are for sale at my Teespring site, which you can find a link to down in the description. Lastly, this video would not be possible if it wasn't for the support of my patrons over on Patreon. They're literally making it possible for me to pay my rent, feed my cats, and make this content for you. So if you want to help out and maybe see videos early, you can go to patreon.com/stepbackhistory and sign up for as little as $1 a month. Thank you very much, everybody, and come back soon for more Step Back. I was actually going to do a whole bit for this, but then I realized that I don't know where I put the yellow vest, so I'm just going to keep the hat, I guess, for this video.